Hey, how you doing? This is Adam Post, publisher of more than 1,000 comic books and covering the worse than woke comics coming out of the mainstream big two companies. Really interesting article coming from Bounding Into Comics, covering comments from former DC writer Chuck Dixon, who is an absolute legend, who says that wokeness by itself isn't what's killing comic books. I absolutely agree with him. He covers a part of this that I hadn't actually thought of, but I've got some additional thoughts on this, and would be great to talk to Chuck Dixon about it sometime. Let's get into this article. Before we do, please be sure you are subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up. I really appreciate you guys. Okay, so what Chuck Dixon says here is that it's not just wokeness that's killing comic books, it's that people who really don't care about the comic books are making the comic books, and the people without talent are getting way too many jobs. He goes into it in more detail. For me, a big problem is the lack of an editor-in-chief that actually is an executive editor-in-chief, someone who knows what the standards are supposed to be for stories and storytelling. And that doesn't just mean that the company's aesthetic should be everyone draws amazingly well like Todd McFarlane and they're creating their own styles and showcasing their own styles. That was fantastic. It was amazing to see what Todd McFarlane could do on Spider-Man #1 back in the day and what the Image Comics guys could do back in the day. But that was also kind of the beginning of the end of having editorial control over Marvel's comics. Because without Jim Shooter there holding down the fort and saying, hey, hold on a second, we do have a Marvel style, we have a look, we have a feel, we need to be consistent throughout the line, it became impossible to replace the Image guys once the Image guys left. And when you bought a Marvel comic, you'd have to wonder, like, well, what are you expecting? If you've bought Marvel comics before Todd McFarlane and the Image guys came along, you had a certain expectation of what they would be. That was a certain look, a certain feel, a certain type of storytelling. After the Image Comics guys came and went, really the editorial standards for Marvel were a complete shambles. But let's get into this article. So Bounding in Comics has been doing an amazing job of covering wokeness and how it's impacting pop culture in movies and comics and games, TV. Really, they've done an amazing job of it. But Chuck Dixon is actually pointing out that, look, it's not just wokeness. Wokeness is there, but if you took the wokeness out, you'd still have bad comics. In episode 134 of his question and answer series, Chuck Dixon was asked his opinion about the comic book industry and what form it could take if it wasn't for woke content, and his answer might surprise you. Quote, I don't think it would be all that different, he said, adding that in his view, it was people lacking talent, gaining power that sparked the decline. They only latched onto wokeness later, Dixon says, and then began hiring others who have a stronger embrace of the ideology, at least on the surface. Quote, you know, a lot of this stuff is job security, the author explained. You've got to go along. You've got to lockstep. You've got to march along with the rest. You've got to raise your fist in anger with everybody else, even if you don't feel angry, because you don't want to be, you don't want to conform. And that's what this is about. It's about conforming. Conforming is a bad thing in a creative industry. The only conforming that you should have is if there's an editorial standard that people are trying to live up to. So that when someone buys a Marvel comic, buys a DC comic, there's a certain level of expectation of what the storytelling is going to be, what the presentation is going to be, what the level of quality is going to be, how the character is generally going to be treated. You can have surprises, but not things like Robin falling in bisexual love with this guy. You know, whatever this direction is that DC decided they had to go just to frustrate fans. Dixon elaborated. It's about bending the knee, and in order to keep the jobs, a lot of the people in charge, particularly Marvel and DC, conform because you can't be speaking out or you'll lose your job. Quote, so I think wokeism just filled the void of indifference that most of the editors and administrative people, accounting companies, were feeling. They didn't care about the product anymore, so someone who did care, not about the product, but about getting their message out, came to fill in. Fantastic point. If you had a strong editorial structure, you know, there was a company called Random House. You know why they're called Random House? Because they publish any kind of book title under that masthead. Marvel is not supposed to be Random House. They're supposed to publish what would be a Marvel branded comic, which would have a certain look, a certain feel, a certain aesthetic, including a certain quality of art and also a certain style of storytelling. That was carefully constructed and maintained during the Stan Lee days, when Jim Shooter came on. When I got into comics as a kid, I was buying Secret Wars, the original version, off the stands. The first major Marvel crossover, the first major company comics crossover that really ever existed. And Marvel was going through a tremendous resurgence at the time. As a kid, you don't know it. You just like the books that you're picking up off the stands. X-Men, Daredevil, the Wolverine limited series. I mean, classic books I can remember now. This was all under the direction of a strong editorial kingpin, Jim Shooter. Now, a lot of people had problems with Jim Shooter, and that's fine. But the books were selling, the editorial was good, and tremendous creators were making tremendous contributions. But they all looked and felt like Marvel Comics, and no one artist redefined storytelling during that phase. The entire line sold well. So Chuck goes on to say, I don't think comics would be... Wokeism isn't killing comics, he said. It's a symptom. Many things killed American comics. Poor business decisions, indifference, a failure to produce quality material, a chasing away of top creators. There's a Superman making out with his friend. Dixon went on. Marvel and DC created their own competition by chasing away top talent who are not going to go gentle into that good night. You've got top talent, people at the peak of their powers are going to keep doing comics. Quote, and they are going to do them for whoever will pay them to do them, he continued, or as you've seen in recent years, they'll find a way to finance themselves. And that's whose DC's and Marvel's competition is. It's death by 1,000 cuts. Dixon added, all of these top talent writers, pencilers, inkers, and colorists that Marvel and DC have let go are stealing their audience, and they're not really stealing it because they've abandoned their audience. The final straw of wokeism entered the picture at that point, with new creators making up the vanguard of DC and Marvel, demanding their readers change, demanding that readers would have to adopt the values of the creators who decided they would go ahead, make themselves really proud of themselves, and just change everything about Marvel, everything about DC, everything about the superheroes that you cared about for decades. And they just wanted you to love what they were doing because they were proud of themselves for making it, even though it completely changed and violated all the history, all the expectations of customers. Rather than change, a lot of readers stopped buying comics, as they were invited to do by Kelly Sue DeConnick. And she was driven by politics, but Dixon doesn't care. If you like my comics, God bless you, he says. Obviously, so Chuck Dixon, like me and any of us producing comics, we're happy to sell them to you. We're not going to say, hey, if you don't like my politics, don't read my comics. It's a ridiculous, ridiculous statement. There's going to be, I'll put a link to Chuck's question and answer, and also urge you to subscribe to his channel. He's great. He's incredibly knowledgeable, very entertaining to listen to. Definitely check him out and subscribe to his channel. But what I'll tell you also about comics is editors and publishers were very careful about how their characters were portrayed and what would and what wouldn't be appropriate for their comics. Someone I got to know a little bit in the early 1990s, I referenced Jim Shooter. We met with him a couple of times when we were publishing comics, and he gave us some advice on what we wound up publishing under Triumphant Comics. He was explaining one of his proudest things about his Valiant Comic Books company was that the line of Valiant Comics was selling all within plus or minus 20%. So there wasn't a Valiant title that didn't sell at least 80% of what the highest title was selling, because there was a line of comics they were producing. It was a common aesthetic. And it didn't mean that creators couldn't do great work. It just meant consumers could have a certain expectation and it would be consistently delivered on, as opposed to this woke stuff where they're delivering on the opposite of what you would expect to try to shock you and make you have no other option but to accept that your heroes, comics that you like, the characters that you love, are now these insane versions of them changed up to match these people's politics. I think Chuck Dixon makes a fantastic point here. If you took the wokeness out and you just had amateurish with a mix of amateurish and professional creators, would you still have good comics? Let me know what you think in the comments below. Now, I've worked with a couple of good comic book editors. I'm working with one now. They're brilliant. They're like music producers. I don't know if you know who Rick Rubin is. I've been studying him recently, he put out a book. An editor's job is to bring out the best in everyone, to let them know what the expectations are, and then to help them to get to where they need to get, wherever their weaknesses are, to give them confidence, to give them references, to give them information, to give them opportunity. That's the thing that's been missing for a couple of decades, because there's no understanding and respect for what everyone's roles are in the process. Creators should be highly regarded in producing content. And at the same time, producers/editors should also be respected. But it's a matter of kind of mixing, like if you want to do everything yourself and you don't want any feedback, you don't need anybody helping you, that's great. And there are some creators that have tremendous success without any help from any guide, from any editors. But there are some people who wind up doing their best work when they get a little help from people who have been in the industry and worked with some of the top talent over the decades. People who've worked closely with Stan Lee, Mort Weisinger, who've been told by the old guys some of the secrets of storytelling. There's a lot that we can learn from the greats, Will Eisner as well. If you haven't checked out Will Eisner's book on sequential art and storytelling, definitely check it out. There's a section on hieroglyphics that I only saw just a few years ago that really blew me away. There's so much talent and so much genius and so much knowledge out there. It's great to collaborate. It's great to work with other people. But I think it's true. When we stopped having people in the comic book industry who really cared at every level, you need it in the art, the writing, and the editorial. You can't cut any one of those out and produce great work. You can occasionally, but certainly you can't do it for a line of classic comic book characters. It's not going to happen. But let me know what you think in the comments below. Always love to see your comments. Please be sure you are also subscribed to the channel. Click the bell for notifications. Give me a thumbs up, and I'll see you again soon with another video. And if I don't see you, I will miss you.